Yes, I'm delighted to be joined by James Skinner, who is the founder and chief executive of CANZUK International, which is a group campaigning for closer association between the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. You're in Toronto at the moment. Could you kind of start by outlining what's the CANZUK vision?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on as well. I really appreciate it. So the vision of CANZUK, essentially, as you just mentioned, it's an acronym for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. And the vision for it is really founded on the principle of these four countries working together as sovereign, independent nations, basically for the betterment of their economies and also for the opportunities of their citizens. And the way we promote that is through three sort of main objectives. The first would be reciprocal migration, whereby citizens of these four countries could freely live and work in the other countries, minus a few sort of stipulations and requirements, but I'm sure we'll probably get to that later on in this interview. And then obviously trade as well, free trade between these countries, which of course would maximize trading potential, opening up trade to about $3.5 trillion between these countries, also removing tariffs and barriers to commerce. Yeah. Also allowing for the mutual skills recognition for professionals too between these countries. And then of course the third aspect as well would be foreign policy cooperation. So again, acting independently and as sovereign nations, they could improve on their relationship that they already have in terms of military and defense. That would be things through perhaps the United Nations Security Council with the UK, with a seat on the permanent seat on the UNSC there. Things like the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, mutual military operations around the world for peacekeeping and international security and things like that. So really it's those three things that we focus on, which could also then develop into further initiatives down the line, perhaps like educational initiatives or initiatives towards communications and space and things like that. So really it's effectively an alliance of like-minded countries which would work together for the interests of basically global diplomacy, but also as well for the betterment of their economies and their citizens and the opportunities that come from that as well.
Yeah, but obviously it's quite a new idea, and it's an idea that has quite a lot of public support. I mean, I know you guys did a survey in, I think it was 2017, something like that.
2018, yeah.
2018 found overwhelming support for CANZUK proposals in all four countries. UK was the lowest actually, which surprised me. But does it have so much political support? Is this still a movement which has public support but not political support, and how can you change that?
So it has public support, but we've actually started seeing a shift in the political support as well as more and more people start to realize it. So where you are in the UK right now, obviously, independent polling was actually done of members of parliament in the UK by Savanta Comres, and the results are available on their website and also on our website if anyone wants to check it out. But the political support there as well is also testimony to how much CANZUK is growing within the respective parliaments of the CANZUK countries. In the UK right now, I think it was polled about 94% of MPs support a CANZUK free trade deal. It's about 61% of MPs support free movement within the CANZUK countries as well. 73% of Labour MPs actually support CANZUK free movement. So it's gaining a lot of political support in that sense. Also here in Canada as well, we've shifted the needle tremendously, whereby the official opposition in Canada have actually adopted CANZUK as their official party policy too. Australia and New Zealand were also making headway, whereby New Zealand are very keen to get things going as well. We're engaging with a lot of MPs there. So really, as well as the public support that we've had from the populations of these countries, there's also that political support rising too, which is incredibly encouraging to see. And it's also reflective in things that, we have an all-party parliamentary group in the UK as well, specifically dedicated to CANZUK, which is uniting members of parliament from the Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrats, whatever it may be, to discuss CANZUK and actually promote it within the parliament as well. So it's certainly growing rapidly, far quicker than we would have ever expected when I founded the organization back in 2015. So, which is tremendous to see the public and the political support there for that.
I mean, are you now a full-time advocate for this, or is this kind of like, an on-the-side thing where you're not?
Oh no, this is full-time. It's full-time. I mean, I would love it to be, I love that it is full time, but at the same time, that there's so much work to be done and there's so much outreach and so many meetings to be done. I would not be able to cope if it was just simply a part-time gig. So it's a full-time thing, yeah.
I mean, one thing I found quite interesting, obviously, it's as you said, it's got a lot of public support and it's got a lot of political support. And one thing I found very interesting, what you just said, is that the political support is moving beyond just the right. Because, I mean, you know, kind of the classical criticism of this is it's a project of the right. But if you were saying, you know, Labour MPs are getting sympathetic, that kind of thing, do you think that can be intensified? Do you think it can become clearly not just a project of the right? It can become, you know, cross-political?
Yeah, I think so. And like you rightly point out, it was, you know, somewhat of an issue for us that, you know, under no intention of our own, we've always been non-partisan. We've always reached out to any members of parliament or senators, whatever they may be, from whatever political party they're from. But it's always, for whatever reason, always appealed to those perhaps right of centre, so those in the conservative factions. And, you know, people have reasons for that. And, you know, there's probably many. But, you know, what we're starting to see now is that, you know, which is really great to see, is that people or MPs, senators from left of centre parties are also starting to see the value in it. So Jacinda Ardern, for example, in New Zealand is obviously a left of centre Labour government, but at the same time, we're doing a lot of outreach to them as well. And even before the election, you know, her government was essentially fond of expanding the closer economic relations trade agreement that they currently have with countries like the CANZUK countries. So that was also refreshing to see. And also as well, the recent polling done in the UK of MPs, that's also revealed that, you know, a majority of Labour members of Parliament, you know, support initiatives within CANZUK, like reciprocal migration and the trade and, you know, things like that. So it's really refreshing to see that it's actually taking a shift from right of centre parties and gradually now starting to come into the middle. So from the public, we've always seen that, you know, it's been a wide variety of support from everybody from centre left, centre right, you know, right in the middle. They've always supported CANZUK, and there hasn't been really any disparity in terms of the people who support it there. But politically, like you say, it's always, you know, it's mostly leaned towards the centre right, but now it is starting to come back into the middle, which is great to see. And obviously, you know, hopefully that'll continue to happen. And, you know, parties from whatever stripes and colours they may be from will see the benefits of CANZUK moving forward.
I mean, presumably it is possible to make quite a strong left-wing case for CANZUK, as in, I mean, you know, fundamentally it's an immigration liberalising project. I mean, you know, that should appeal quite a lot to the same type of people who are very pro-EU and anti-Brexit.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, it should absolutely, and I really hope it will, because you know, there's no secret that in the UK, for example, those who are more pro-EU tend to be more centre-left, whereas those who are more anti-EU tend to be more centre-right. But the beauty of CANZUK is that it kind of brings everybody together in the sense that, you know, CANZUK is you know, an idea that is external of the European Union, so those on the centre-right can support it. But of course, as well, it's also those liberalisation sort of features about it too, such as the reciprocal migration and the trade, which you know, we always say improves on what the EU has and the models they have, but it still has that principle whereby people can move freely between these countries. There can be free trade, which enhances economies and businesses and, you know, career opportunities for people. So it really does appeal to a variety of people, regardless of what political affiliation they may have. So, and like I say, hopefully, again, that'll continue into the future to, you know, reach across everybody from whatever political background they may have.
Yeah. And presumably the intention isn't to follow the EU in a sense. Would there be some kind of supranational organisation? Would there be like a CANZUK president or anything like that? Or is it, you know, much below that level?
Oh, it's much below that level. So we always emphasize this wholeheartedly. It would very much be completely different to what the EU structure is. Absolutely. It would share common values with the European Union. So for example, the European Union obviously has those principles whereby you can move freely between the countries and, you know, you can trade between these countries, which are values that we at CANZUK also share. But CANZUK itself would be a very different model to what the European Union has. So for example, where the EU has gone down the route of having a European Parliament, having an EU Commission, having a centralized currency, a centralized court system, CANZUK would be nothing of the sort of that, nor would we ever advocate for that to be the case. I mean, to be honest, it'd be absolute folly for us to even advocate for that in the first place, because the UK just left the EU for, you know, some of those reasons. So why would we, you know, endorse the EU to join another alliance, which would, you know, basically encompass the same sort of model? So we would never advocate for that. We never would advocate for that. What we've always advocated is that these countries would work as sovereign, independent countries, on the international stage, working together for initiatives like reciprocal migration, trade, foreign policy, things like that. So it would in no way emulate the EU model, nor even emulate the EU sort of protocols that they have for things like reciprocal migration. So where in the EU right now, especially within the Schengen agreement, citizens are free to travel and live and work in these countries without any customs or borders checks, which is great if you're a law-abiding citizen. But if you're someone with, shall we say, bad intentions, perhaps you're part of a criminal syndicate or you're part of a terrorist organization, that's never a good idea to have unchecked migration between the countries, because it just allows for cross-border criminal activity. But CANZUK eliminates that, because what it effectively does in terms of reciprocal migration emulates the agreement that's already in place between Australia and New Zealand, and it's called the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement. For the continuation of this interview, I'll just refer to it as the TTTA, just to save me calling it the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement. But effectively what that means is citizens of Australia can live and work freely in New Zealand, and vice versa. Citizens of New Zealand can freely live and work in Australia as well. But there are requirements in place whereby you must not have a serious criminal conviction, i.e. must have not been in prison for longer than 12 months or have a criminal record. You must not have an infectious health condition like tuberculosis, whereby you could perhaps spread it to the population of your host country. You must not be part of any terrorist organization. If you're on a terrorist watch list, then again, you're not free to move. So it kind of encompasses the principles of the EU, but at the same time with common sense protocols in place to ensure that it's good law-abiding citizens who move freely between CANZUK, and not those who perhaps have negative intentions, in terms of terrorism, or perhaps those who have infectious health conditions which could pose a public health and safety risk to others within the CANZUK population. So it's different to the EU in those ways, both structurally and also in terms of protocol for reciprocal migration, which I think is certainly applicable and common sense for definitely the 21st century.
I mean, it's very, because obviously, there's the economic arguments for it, and there's the kind of the individual advantage of having the free movement. But is there a way that you almost see it as a strategic thing as well, as in kind of an extra way of strengthening the Liberal Democratic Alliance? I mean, maybe even almost a third kind of pillar of the Liberal Democratic Alliance after the United States and the European Union. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that's obviously quite important in the modern day as well, because we're seeing the rise of authoritarian governments who have shall we say, a lot of negative sentiment towards, the West, especially. And we're talking, things like the Chinese Communist Party, factions within Iran, North Korea. So, of course, it's always good for like-minded nations in that sense to strengthen, like you said, as you call it, that liberal democratic alliance, along with the United States and even the European Union, whereby, there's that extra clout added to the preservance of human rights, democracy, the rule of law. So, of course, that's also an added benefit as well. And also, like many have pointed out too, that CANZUK is also a shining example to the rest of the world in the sense of how these liberal democracies can work together as mutual friends, as allies, as people who have stuck together for generations and will continue to do so into the future. How they can work together and implement programs in place like reciprocal migration, for example, or trade, or mutual foreign policy, or things like that, whereby they can actually provide benefits not only for their own countries, but also as well for the world, whether that be, perhaps helping with international peacekeeping, or, assisting with economic development in less developed countries, whatever it may be. So I think, it's certainly also got that element too, whereby it really is a shining example to the rest of the world of how countries can mutually cooperate and benefit their populations at large.
I mean, how the kind of the foreign policy cooperation work? Is that basically just, we'll try and be friendly to each other and we'll try and talk to each other? Or is there anything more kind of structured? Is there anything, is there like a compulsive element in it?
Yes, again, there's nothing compulsive, nothing compulsory about CANZUK. Like I say, it's always going to be, four countries working together independently. But at the same time, like you say, yes, part of it is obviously talking nicely to each other, working together, as you rightly pointed out. But at the same time, there's also added benefits to it as well, and added initiatives that these countries can think of. Obviously, like I mentioned before, there is that element of a military and defense pact whereby, these countries, instead of acting independently, they could act even more together than what they already do. I believe the combined, military expenditure of these countries would be in the region of about $110 billion. which would actually make it the third largest in the world, which, like I say, again, also provides a significant deterrent against adversarial actions from countries like perhaps China, Iran, North Korea, who might have negative intentions against the CANZUK countries, both in terms of physical military capacity, but also in terms of cyber security as well, and the growing threats online. But of course, as well, it's just the fact that these countries can work together in that way, like I say, which I think is reflective of how well these countries work and how close their bonds are, and how beneficial that would be for the world at large in that sense as well. There's also other initiatives that they can consider too. So, for example, like I mentioned before, the United Kingdom has a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, which right now, obviously, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand don't have any representation on that council. But de facto, what the UK could do is actually offer that seat as, yes, it is, under the UN Charter, it'll always be a United Kingdom seat, but they could de facto offer Canada, Australia, and New Zealand representation on that council as well, which again gives the CANZUK countries an added voice on the largest security council in the world to basically, express their opinions towards the respect of human rights and democracy around the world. Also, as well, things like working together on the already existing Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which should increase, national safety and security. So there's a variety of ways that these countries can certainly work together on the foreign policy stage. And again, not combining their foreign policies, so there's a mutual foreign policy, but there would certainly be a foreign policy which they could work together independently on. And, the things that they agree on, they could work together to promote that in the world, which again would be, excellent, not just for the CANZUK countries, but for the world at large.
It's very interesting that you mentioned the Five Eyes Alliance, which is obviously the CANZUK countries plus the United States. So all the CANZUK countries are advanced democracies, they're liberal democracies, they're English speaking, they've got a certain level of historical connection. But the same is also true of the United States. Is there an argument for including the United States in this, or is there a reason why it hasn't been included?
The United States is an interesting one. Yes, there's we often get asked that a lot on, through emails, through social media, why not include the United States? There's a variety of reasons for it. I mean, the top two I could probably think of off the top of my head right now, just for brevity and to save time, really, without going too much into it. The top two I would think is number one, the United States, having worked in the United States myself for the US Congress, I understand the sort of mentality of the United States, that they're very proud of their independence, they're very proud of their history. I think to say to the American government that, how about you join onto this initiative whereby, how about you join onto this initiative whereby, the Queen is the head of state, these are all Commonwealth countries, and for you to come back into this, I don't think it would reflect well.
Would the Queen have some kind of formal role in CANZUK?
No more than she would right now. No more than she would right now. For example, like, the monarchy acting as the sovereign, they would still have the same role as they do now in terms of ratifying legislation through royal assent, doing representation around the Commonwealth and the CANZUK countries. So it would be exactly the same. We always consider the monarchy as a cornerstone of what CANZUK can represent in terms of its security, its stability, its upholding the rule of law. But again, the monarchy's role would not change. We would not advocate for the monarchy to have an increased role within CANZUK or increased powers. It really is an alliance of these countries being able to retain their sovereignty and keep the status quo while also working together as like-minded allies on the world stage. So for the US anyway, to say to the US, well, would you consider coming back into this? I think, in terms of public support, I don't think the US would be very fond of it, just simply because the US, culturally has a very strong mentality for independence and everything that the American Revolution represented. So for them to come back into something whereby, there would certainly be political, opposition to it, definitely. So, I mean, that's just one of the reasons. The other reason as well, which is a more practical reason, is that you consider the reciprocal migration element of CANZUK too. You're talking an element of maybe about 135 million citizens across the CANZUK countries who could live and work freely in these countries. Now you compare that to the United States, which currently right now I think is close to a population of about 340 million citizens. You're looking at a population in the United States which is almost triple the size of all the CANZUK countries combined. So again, having that reciprocal migration element with the United States, it would effectively mean that the United States would have, incredible dominance in terms of what is said, how things are managed in terms of reciprocal migration, and also as well other elements of CANZUK too. So again, having the United States, as it is with any other country as well, you've got to be very careful in terms of what countries you would bring into it, just because of, you know, certain economic or socioeconomic and cultural issues too. So those are the top two reasons anyway why we would not consider the United States to be a partner in this. Certainly a partner in terms of, you know, the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, like you mentioned. I mean, obviously the US is an ally. I'm very fond of the US, having lived and worked there for some time. You know, the United States is a tremendous friend to these countries, but at the same time, to bring it in to a CANZUK arrangement, I think would be, you know, a little bit risky, and probably not for the betterment of everybody at this point.
Yeah, and of course there are always people, and let's say I think this argument's pretty ridiculous, but there's always people that try and bring in race or kind of neo-imperialism. I mean, despite the fact that the CANZUK countries are far more ethnically diverse than the EU, for example, which you know, but this problem doesn't need to apply to the EU. I mean, presumably the reason for excluding other countries is basically that you need countries on a similar income level. And if hypothetically, say, some of the Caribbean islands were to reach that income level, would they then be considered for membership?
So yeah, this is a great question. So again, like you say, like the Caribbean islands, like perhaps like Bahamas, or, you know, one we often get as well is Singapore, because you know, obviously the CANZUK countries, you know, you have North America, you have Australasia, you have Europe, and then Singapore would provide, you know, that base, so to speak, in Asia. You know, the reason we don't consider Singapore right now is that even though it's economically developed, obviously culturally speaking, it's a little bit different, because you know, one of the biggest reasons right now is that homosexuality is still frowned upon in Singapore, which of course goes against the values of, you know, the CANZUK countries and what they stand for. I think chastisement of children in schools is still legally on the books as well. So there's certain cultural elements as to why we wouldn't consider Singapore at that point. Now, say hypothetically, you know, maybe 30 years in the future, 20 years, 30 years in the future, Singapore comes into perfect alignment with the CANZUK countries, whereby, you know, the economic indexes are exactly the same, culturally, and or maybe not culturally, but, you know, in terms of sort of legislation, like what's on the statute books, they sort of align with the CANZUK countries as well. There is that consideration that, yeah, maybe it's advantageous for Singapore to come into a CANZUK arrangement. But what and I think many others would probably appreciate at that point is that it wouldn't just be an automatic membership, because, you know, we've seen that happen with the European Union, whereby it's built itself up to the point where, at, you know, its peak, it was 28 member states.
Yeah.
And not everybody agreed with the annexation of other countries as well. So for CANZUK to learn from that, what I would personally favor is that if there was at some point to be, you know, a CANZUK plus, like say, for example, like with Singapore, so it become CANZUKs. Although at that point, I'd probably advocate for a change of name at that point. But, you know, say Singapore was to, you know, want to come into this alliance, I would certainly favor there being, you know, a referendum in each of the CANZUK countries to decide whether that happens. And that's not just Singapore, that would be any other country in the world, whether it be the United States, whether it be Norway, South Africa, whatever it may be. I would certainly favor there being a referendum in each of the CANZUK countries, and it being done by unanimous consent, because, you know, one of the founding principles of CANZUK is that these are, like you say, liberal democracies who believe in democracy. So it's only fair that if CANZUK was to progress in that manner, outside of the parameters that it was initially founded, that the people would have a say on that. So for me, I would certainly favor a referendum, and it being a unanimous referendum whereby it's a majority in all 4 countries before anything like that was to happen.
I mean, you live in Toronto. I mean, you were just saying off camera, you're on the verge of becoming a Canadian citizen. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Would this cause any trouble with Canada's kind of constitutional assessment between the Anglophiles and the Francophiles? Or can that in some way be managed and incorporated?
I think it can easily be managed and incorporated. So, you know, obviously in Quebec, there's obviously it's mainly Francophone, but yeah. Of course, we've done polling in Quebec as well. And we've actually seen that about, I'd have to look back at the stats, but I think it's in the region of about 58 to 60% of Quebec support CANZUK as well for what it stands. And there's actually a polling done recently by the Macdonald Laurier Institute, not too long ago. I think we're talking maybe 2 months ago, whereby they actually surveyed, they asked people in Quebec which countries you feel most favorably towards. And I think the United Kingdom was actually one of Quebec's most favored countries in that sense. So there's a lot of people speculating on social media that, oh, Quebec wouldn't be for this, but it's completely untrue. Quebec are actually very much in favor of CANZUK, and they look very favorably on the CANZUK countries as well. Having lived in many of the CANZUK countries, there's always been, quite a large Quebec contingent wherever I've gone, and they've always, loved working there, because despite having the linguistic difference, I find most Quebecois people are bilingual anyway, so it doesn't really affect them. And also as well, they always have that sense of feeling at home, whether they're in New Zealand, Australia, the UK, because the cultures are very similar in that sense. So in terms of actually implementing CANZUK with say the Anglophone and the Francophone, I don't think there'd be any issue whatsoever. It'd be very simple to implement, especially under federal prerogative. With Canada, it'd be very easy to implement, and I think Quebec would be more than happy to be a part of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed for certainly for the past year or so, quite a lot of CANZUK stuff on the foreign policy stuff has been happening almost de facto. So on China, the UK, Canada, and Australia have released joint statements. I think they've done the same on Russia as well. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah.
But the one missing then is New Zealand. I mean, do you think that New Zealand has a different foreign policy role to the Canada? Because the Canada, UK, and Australia obviously all have a serious military presence. They're prepared to use it overseas. Do you think that New Zealand's a bit more isolationist, and would it be happy to be incorporated in a slightly more aggressive bloc?
I think so, because as you mentioned before, the polling we did actually showed that New Zealand was the most supportive of CANZUK. I mean, it's quite common in New Zealand for New Zealanders, for example, as sort of their rite of passage to adulthood, so to speak, that they do their year abroad in different countries, and oftentimes it's Canada or the UK. So obviously, our polling showed about 82% of New Zealanders were incredibly supportive of what CANZUK was about, and I think polling earlier than that as well, conducted by the Royal Commonwealth Society about 2 years earlier, also showed similar results, about 81 or 80% or so. So there's incredible public support there for it. Politically, as you rightfully pointed out, the CANZUK countries and the USA have stood before and condemned the actions in Hong Kong, for example, like what the Chinese authorities were doing. The most recent one obviously was missing New Zealand. As to why that's happened, I'm not entirely sure. And again, that is the prerogative of New Zealand, because like I say, CANZUK is not compelling these countries to act in a certain way. It's through a voluntary association. It's through them wanting to be a part of this and wanting to work together, and not having something like, for example, a European central body compelling them to do so. Yeah. So that's not the route we want to go. So as to why New Zealand has done that, I'm not entirely sure. Obviously, I can't speak for the New Zealand government, but I think ultimately, though, given the public support and also as well for the political support that we've got from different MPs in New Zealand, and also as well the support that Jacinda Ardern has shown and the sympathy she's shown towards the CANZUK countries in the past as well, before her recent election that happened last year, I think ultimately, I think there wouldn't be an issue with New Zealand being a part of it. And I think they'd be all the more happy to join. That's just my personal opinion, though. Obviously, others will have a different opinion. But for me, I think it would be a slam dunk for New Zealand, so to speak.
I mean, as an idea, CANZUK, I became aware of it probably 3-4 years ago. And I've been hearing more and more about it. It feels like it's gaining momentum. I mean, is that something you're expecting to continue? Have you almost been surprised by how much support you've got?
Completely surprised. Yeah. I mean, I started the whole thing back in 2015, and it was really nothing but me and a laptop. And I had this idea, and I thought, I'll start a petition online to see if there's any, public interest for it. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, if I get 200 signatures on this petition by the end of the year, I'll be delighted with that, because that's 200 people I can reach out to and sort of see how we can work together to see if there's any, steps forward to making this happen. But that petition just took off. I had MPs, senators getting in touch saying it was a great idea. The public sort of advocated for it. Media outlets were picking up on it. And it just grew way more than I ever would have dreamed it would have, which I think is testimony to the fact that it's an idea that people see a lot of value in. Not everybody thinks it's a good idea, and that's okay, but the vast majority of people see incredible value in it and think it's a really good idea. And of course, that's just added to the whole growth, not only just politically, but publicly as well, to what CANZUK is. And, to answer your question, absolutely, I do, as more and more people find out about this and as support snowballs and grows and gets bigger, I really do see, obviously, more and more people, wanting to get involved and campaigning and speaking with their MPs and saying, hey, we should do this, and more MPs and senators getting involved and wanting to work together to make this happen. So, like right now, obviously, we're working with different departments in these governments and working with MPs and senators, and they're all incredibly enthused by it. So, the support has been magnificent. I could not have asked for anything better, and I only expect that support to grow and continue into the future as well.
Yeah, but it's just my perception. It's maybe completely wrong, but it seems that CANZUK is quite advanced in terms of kind of like its support base in Canada and the United Kingdom. Is Australia and New Zealand a little bit lower, or certainly in terms of kind of public figures? Do you think that's fair, or is that just I've been reading the wrong people?
No, I think that's actually fair. To be honest with you, I think that's actually fair. I think one part of it's to do with population. I think obviously the UK is the most populated. So of course, even though CANZUK International is based in Canada, we actually have most of our support in the UK. And I think that's just reflective of the population. Our second most support is here in Canada. Third most obviously is Australia, and then fourth most is New Zealand. So it's very reflective across the board of each country's populations. Yeah. As well, I think you're quite spot on that it's been a lot easier to sort of capture the imagination of the public in Canada and the UK. New Zealand's been quite easy as well, respective of their populations. Obviously, like I said, 82% of New Zealanders support what we're proposing. So, it's been very easy to capture that as well. And that support's only going to grow in the future. Australia as well has also been a little bit far behind. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Number one, you could say that Australia, you could say it is a little bit more nationalist, so it's a little bit of a harder nut to crack, which is fair enough. Like I totally understand that. Yeah. And then of course as well, there's also been, I don't want to say political instability, but obviously Australia has had a long period of where they've changed governments very, very quickly. I can't remember the stat off my head, but I think over the last 8 years or so, or 10 years or so, they've had 5 different prime ministers or something. So of course, when you have governments coming in and changing all the time, obviously it shakes things up. There's staff turnover, policies get shifted down the agenda, others get shifted up. So it's been more and more difficult to navigate, Australian waters in that sense, because obviously their system is a little bit more, encompasses turnover a little bit more than any of the other CANZUK countries. So it's been a little bit trickier in that sense. But, again, from our polling, we've seen that about 73% of Australians support what, CANZUK and, reciprocal migration and trade between these countries. We've got a lot of support now, or we're gaining a lot of support now from MPs and senators in that country. So we only expect that to continue growing as well. And of course, like I say, it's a little bit more tricky to navigate the waters just because of, the upheaval that constantly goes on in the Australian Parliament, which makes for exciting viewing and reading as well. But, we're going to carry on campaigning there, and we have no doubt that we'll, eventually get the support in Australia up to where we think it actually is, and in line with the other CANZUK countries too.
I mean, do you think there's any risk for the movement that it kind of becomes a proxy for other debates in each individual country? So in the UK, obviously, it gets very intertwined with the Brexit debate. In Australia, it could get quite intertwined, I imagine, with the Republic debate. Obviously, that's also an opportunity. But is that something you're kind of concerned about, trying to stop yourself becoming proxies for different national conflicts?
It's not something we're too focused on right now, because, as a great example that you mentioned there, the sort of debate about whether Australia stays in, the Commonwealth, or whether it becomes a republic, and things like that. I mean, obviously we understand, the opinions of Republicans in Australia, because don't forget, we have the same in Canada. Our next door neighbor in Quebec, there's a large contingency there, the Bloc Québécois, who obviously want Quebec to be separate from Canada in that sense. So, and we understand, the pros and cons of each. To be honest, like given the example you gave, like Australia, in terms of it becoming a republic, we haven't really thought too much about it, because even hypothetically, I know support right now, recent polling in Australia has shown that support for Australia becoming a republic is pretty much at an all-time low. I think at the lowest since it's been since the 1970s or something. So again, another reason why we haven't given it too much thought. But in a hypothetical world, say Australia was to become a republic, and separate from the Commonwealth and no longer have the Queen as head of state, again, it wouldn't really affect CANZUK too much, because, for Australia to engage in reciprocal migration with New Zealand, Canada, and the UK, you don't need a monarchy to oversee that. That's just, the prerogative of the government to implement that in the first place. Very similar to right now, Australia shares free movement with New Zealand under the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement. If Australia was to become a republic tomorrow, the TTTA would still be in place. It doesn't need the monarchy to uphold the TTTA. That's just up to the Australian government. So providing Australia has a government in place, then CANZUK would still function, just as well. Same with free trade. You don't need the monarchy to implement the CER agreement between Australia and New Zealand. You just need the Australian government and the New Zealand government to shake hands and agree to it. Yeah. So, if there was, in a hypothetical sense, if Australia was to become a republic in that sense, obviously, like we say, we see the monarchy as a cornerstone of the values that these countries share and their shared history and their shared ancestry, which I think is important. So if Australia was to become a republic, I'd be disappointed, but at the same time, it wouldn't really affect the functioning or the operations of CANZUK. Things would still carry on relatively normal, so to speak. So we haven't given too much worry about it at this point.
I mean, one thing I was wondering, you may well, it's not know the answer, is how kind of support varies by age. So obviously, young people, certainly in the UK, are far more pro-EU generally. And partly of that is freedom of movement. They like the idea that they can go and move and live in other places in Europe. And obviously, there's an argument that CANZUK is also sort of kind of a replacement. I mean, do you find that? Do you find that young people are more keen? And if not, do you think it's because of the EU issue, because they're still kind of latched onto the EU emotionally?
Yeah, so good question. So from what we've seen, the research we've done, is that you are correct. Young people are more definitely supportive of what CANZUK is, because obviously young people like to travel more.
Yeah.
I myself, I was, I think I was 19 when I left the United Kingdom to go on my worldly adventures. And of course, there's plenty of other 18, 19, 20-year-olds who do exactly the same thing. So of course, the idea of CANZUK to them is a dream, is that they can go and live and work in these countries. They can speak, most of the time they can speak the same language. They can get a job, they can get an apartment, they can, easily integrate in that society very, very easily, which are things that, like very easy things to do, which they didn't necessarily have with the European Union before. So CANZUK to them really appeals. But what we've also seen as well is that CANZUK doesn't just appeal to the younger populations. We also have like really great support from those who I could say who are working professionals to middle age, and those above middle age as well. So working professionals, obviously, it's great for them, because obviously if you're a working professional and your company wants to move you from the United Kingdom to Canada, you no longer, either you as a business or you as an employee of a business, you no longer have to worry about the visas and the arduous immigration controls and spending thousands of dollars, getting the licensing and the permits and all that, and the visas to come and do your job. You can just simply hop on a plane, come here, and your company transfers you straight away. And of course, if you have a business as well and you want to expand to these countries as well, it's great for working professionals, because obviously, under free trade, there'll be removal of tariffs and barriers to commerce. So it's more money in their pocket that way. It's just easier as well for everybody to move across. And then of course, the elderly population as well. There's numerous reasons why, those, I'd say 50 years and over would also support this too. Mostly as well, that a lot of people who are 50 years and older have family in these countries who, at the moment, they can only go and visit them and, spend time with them for a maximum of about 3 months per year, because the visa implementation is in place, which is a shame, because, I don't get many, but the emails I do get from elderly people who are living alone, for example, in the UK or Canada, and they would love to go and spend time with their family, and they just can't do so because, of pension difficulties and, actually, being able to get the visas and afford the visas every time, it breaks my heart every time. So for them, it's really popular as well. But also as well, obviously you don't really have this in the UK, but in Canada, we have a large, what we call a snowbird population, which is effectively those who are, I'd say probably 60 years and older, who will often in the winter time in Canada go down to Mexico to spend maybe 3 or 4 months in Mexico to avoid the brutally cold weather that we get in Canada sometimes, especially here in Ontario. And then of course, after the winter, they'll come back up to Canada. So of course, that's as well money that often leaves Canada and doesn't come back to Canada because they spend that time in South United States or Mexico. But with CANZUK, they also love the idea that they could perhaps hop a flight to the Southern Hemisphere, where in our winter, it's their summer. And of course, they could spend that money down in Australia, whereby, the climate is nice and warm. Everybody speaks, the same language, very similar culture to them as well. And then, of course, as well, don't forget in New Zealand or Australia in the winter, their time when the weather's a little bit, not great, shall we say, they could also come back up to Canada, where our summers are beautiful and it's 30+ degrees heat every time. And of course, that money comes back into Canada. So obviously the snowbird, the elderly population here in Canada, and it would just be beneficial for everybody across the board, really. So it's not only just the young people that we see who do make up most of our support, but also as well, there's benefits for working professionals, those who are middle-aged, shall we say, and those as well who are elderly. Like, there's benefits across the board for everybody. So we have a wide variety of support from different demographics in the age groups.
And what would have to happen for CANZUK to become a reality? I mean, presumably you need to have support from all 4 CANZUK governments, and I guess the 4 legislators as well. Is that kind of the long-term goal?
Yeah, exactly. So obviously, it would never happen anyway, but we would never advocate for CANZUK to be implemented if, say, New Zealand wasn't on board.
Yeah.
Obviously, it requires consent from all 4 countries to engage in it. But the long-term goal, effectively, it's one of the beauties of CANZUK is that in practice, it's actually relatively easy to implement compared to other agreements, like, for example, like what the European Union had to do back with the Treaty of Rome. I believe it was 1952, where they had to spend a long time trying to map this all out and get it all fixed. The beauty of CANZUK is that the legwork for CANZUK is already done, because as I mentioned before, with Australia and New Zealand, they already have these agreements in place.
Yeah.
So with the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement between Australia and New Zealand, that covers the reciprocal migration with the added security protocols. With the Closer Economic Relations Trade Agreement, that's already covered as well with Australia and New Zealand, with the free trade and free movement of goods and services. Foreign policy cooperation, obviously we already have the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, and inviting Canada, Australia and New Zealand onto the UK's permanent seat with the United Nations Security Council is very easy to do. It's just a simple case of making a phone call. So, actually implementing CANZUK is actually incredibly simple. And the beauty of the agreements between Australia and New Zealand as well, in terms of trade and reciprocal migration, is that they're actually informal arrangements, that they're not actually ratified in law the same way that the UK ratifies laws or Canada ratifies laws. It's actually just an informal agreement between those 2 countries. So all we would have to do is really, I mean, of course, there would be legwork involved. The different, like for the UK and Canada to join on to those agreements with Australia and New Zealand, there would have to be some policy work. There would have to be some sort of, discussions about, what this would mean, what that would mean, and so on and so forth. And we're prepared for that. But in terms of actually implementing it, it's incredibly easy to do because, like I say, the Australians and the New Zealanders have already done a lot of the legwork for us in that sense. So, and not to piggyback off their hard work, I apologize if that's how it comes across, but it's one of the beautiful things about CANZUK is that it would be relatively easy to do in that sense. So thank you to the Australians and New Zealanders for doing that for us. Really.
I mean, just one final question. I mean, do you
Yeah.
think CANZUK is something happening sort of with a big bang or incrementally? I mean, do you want like a UK-Australia free trade agreement, then the UK can, and you kind of build it up that way, or do you want this to be one big moment when CANZUK comes into being, and suddenly we have all these extra rights to go and live in these other countries?
Yeah, great question. In the perfect world, if I could have CANZUK happen with a bang tomorrow, I would absolutely love it. Realistically, though, having worked with governments and working with the CANZUK governments right now, I do see it happening incrementally in the future. So, for example, right now, I would be incredibly shocked and amazed if, the current trade negotiations between Australia and the UK and New Zealand and the UK, would be passed, and then the day later they'd be like, okay, free movement starts now. I'd be incredibly shocked if that was to happen. What I imagine would happen, taking the UK and Australia as a perfect example, I would expect that the trade agreement between them would be finalized by Easter. I believe that they've set the target for right now, Easter 2021. From that then, seeing how well that trade agreement would work, I would then expect things such as mutual skills recognition to come into play. So thereby, a professional in Australia could live and work in the UK without having to spend thousands of dollars or years retraining and recertifying their qualifications. Vice versa as well for the UK. If you've got a if you've done a university degree in architecture in the United Kingdom, you could go and live and work in Australia without having to recertify your qualifications. Or perhaps if you're a doctor or if you're a nurse or a dentist or whatever it may be, your qualifications, minus perhaps like a month or two of retraining certain differences between the countries, your qualifications would be recognized in either country. So I expect that would probably come in next as a sort of a complement to a trade agreement. From that then as well, I think, seeing how the relationship builds between the two countries, obviously then there would be, measures introduced about reciprocal migration. So for example, I think right now UK citizens have a 2-year visa to go and live and work in Australia. I'd expect that would probably be increased to maybe like 3 years or 4 years, or instead of it being for those under the age of 30 or 35, they could increase it to the age of 40. And then of course, as you see, it gradually increases over time, not just for Australia as well, but also for all 4 CANZUK countries. So I think in truth, as much as I would love CANZUK to happen with a big bang, and I hope it will happen that way one day, I really hope it will. I think realistically, just with how, sort of carefully governments tread with these sort of things, I think it'll happen piecemeal, step by step. And I think that's how we'll get to CANZUK that way. So it'll probably take a few years, but overall, I think, as long as the end objective is that we have that increased relationship between these countries with reciprocal migration, trade, foreign policy cooperation, as long as we get there in the end, then that's the most important thing.
Yeah. Well, James says it's been a real pleasure having you on. It's a really interesting idea. So yeah, no, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.